Okay, shall we get started? I think we get started, yeah, all right. Wow, I am so delighted to see you all here today for our very special event with our very special guest, Mr. Kenneth Wilcox, former CEO of Silicon Valley Bank. So let's start by giving it up for Kenneth Wilcox. My name is Frederick Green. I'm the chair of the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures here at San Francisco State, where I'm also professor of Chinese. Before we get started, I want to welcome you all to our beautiful new LCA event space. I know it's a little hard to find, so well done for finding your way. And I want to thank Aaron Ben and his team from LCA Live for setting it up so beautifully. So thank you, Aaron and Kirk and Tony, and I know a bunch of other people who were involved in that. Next, I want to acknowledge the departments supporting this event. International Business, Bruce Heyman might be here, I think. Hospitality, Tourism, Events Management, Ryan Smith and Mehmet Ergul, I just saw you. Thank you. Apparel Design Merchandising, Amy Duri is here. International Relations, Burj Ellis might be here. And of course, Modern Languages and Literature. So that's fantastic. I also want to thank your professors who agreed to make today's event part of their syllabi. So thank you, Wen Chao Li, and my colleague Xiaoyang Desai from the Chinese programs. Sally Bach and Jeff Desser, who brought their seminars in business policy and strategic management. Chen Wei Li, who brought her management seminar in leadership and influence skills. Jonathan Woolley, who brought his international relations and global diplomacy class. And Ibru Ipek, also from management. Bao Shirley Tran from business. And of course, Amy Duri from ADM. I don't know if I forgot anybody. If I did, apologies. But yeah, you're also getting a round of applause, everybody. So. And I want to thank you, our students. It's so great to have students from 3 different colleges. So let's see. We have LCA, Chinese and International Relations. Raise your hand. Who's from Chinese and International Relations? Who's from the College of Business, Business Management, Hospitality, Tourism? Yeah, Hospitality, Tourism, Events. Yeah, great. And Apparel Design Merchandising. Yeah, so this is for the students. And they're still trickling in. Yes, I know, it's hard to find this place if you don't know where it is. So last fall, we started 2 new certificates that actually bring classes from all these 3 colleges together. It's the certificate in multilingual and international business competencies and the certificate in multilingual and international tourism competencies. They're super straightforward. You combine 2 language classes with classes in international business or HTM or ADM. I was going to show you a slide with a QR code now, but you might have noticed that our beautiful new space does not yet have a projector. So we went low tech, and we have posters with QR codes for these beautiful certificates, and I think you'll also have some posters circulating in the audience space. So if you're curious about these certificates, and you all should be, scan the QR code and it'll take you to a very simple Qualtrics intake form and you'll hear from us. Now there is another slide I was going to show you. And alternatively, of course, we have posters for that too, okay? It's this one. We are going to give away 28 copies of the book, The China Business Conundrum, written by our distinguished speaker, Kenneth Wilcox. It's about his time in Shanghai and about the things that we'll be talking about in a minute, he'll be talking about. And I can promise you that it's a really fascinating and insightful and very entertaining read. So if you have not scanned the QR code, now is the time, okay? The raffle will close when we get started, and we will have a draw just before we do the Q&A, okay? So there's a QR code and a thing as you come in. And Tammy, I think there's also flyers, right? So Very important. Okay. And now, now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker, Mr. Kenneth Wilcox. Ken began his long banking career at several East Coast banks before earning an MBA from Harvard Business School. In 1990, he joined Silicon Valley Bank, which, under his leadership as CEO from 2001 to 2010, became one of the most influential financial institutions serving the venture capital-backed technology sector. After retiring as global CEO in 2011, Ken then moved to China to oversee a joint venture between Silicon Valley Bank and Shanghai Pudong Development Bank in Shanghai. He served as CEO of that bank for 4 years and then as vice chair until 2019, when he finally did retire. And today's conversation will focus on that joint venture and his time in China. Before his successful banking career, Ken had an equally distinguished career as a professor of German at the University of North Carolina, having earned his PhD in German studies from the Ohio State University. And we will return to that intriguing little detail later. But for now, please join me once more in welcoming Kenneth Wilcox to San Francisco State. Okay. Is yours on too? You just, oh, perfect. Okay. So Ken, in my introduction, I gave the briefest of overviews of your Shanghai adventure. Just so that we all have enough context, could you describe, especially for our younger audience, what Silicon Valley Bank used to do, and in a few sketches describe your journey from Silicon Valley to Shanghai?
Sure. I could, and I will. Before I get started, though, I want to underscore one thing, and that is I assume that many of you know that Silicon Valley Bank doesn't exist anymore. We disappeared in March of 2023, and I hope that when Frederick was speaking, you caught the dates. I quit being CEO at the end of 2010. I moved to China and fundamentally had almost no contact with the bank, and formally disassociated myself from Silicon Valley Bank in 2019. That's my way of saying you can't hold me responsible for what happened. And I'm very sad about it, but I don't take credit. So anyway, the story on Silicon Valley Bank is this. When I joined Silicon Valley Bank about 30 years ago, it was right here in California, and it had what they called the three-legged stool strategy. And by that they meant they were going to have 3 target markets. One was real estate, like strip malls and big houses, and one of them was small business, or we called it Main Street, and then one of them was startups in the technology industry. And so we were divided across those 3. I was in the technology sector. And then, in 2001, my predecessor left to go elsewhere, and the board appointed me CEO. So in that first couple of years, I made 3 big decisions, almost the only big decisions I made in my entire tenure as CEO, which was for 10 years. 3 big decisions that changed the bank pretty substantially. And my first decision was, we don't need to do real estate and we don't need to do small business because frankly, we weren't that good at it. Those are the 2 areas where we would lose money when we lost money. And there were 6,000 or 7,000 banks in the United States that were all doing those same things. So why bother competing against 6,000 or 7,000 banks, many of which are better than you, when you can focus on the one thing that we did really well and that nobody else did, almost nobody else did, and that was work with technology companies, particularly early stage technology companies. So in my first 2 years, we let all the real estate oriented companies and all the small business go to other places like Wells Fargo or wherever. And we just focused on the technology, and we filled up the whole 2/3 that we'd emptied out. We filled it up with more technology companies. Well, the other major decision was let's go global. I wanted to take the bank global. And I really felt that it was important because if you think about industries, technology may be one of the few truly global industries. And what I mean by that is you can have a cheese industry that focuses only on the United States and doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with people in other countries. That's true of almost every industry you can think of. But in technology, and this is the point, if you're not cutting edge everywhere, you can't be cutting edge anywhere. Because technology is all about being cutting edge. I wanted us to go across the world and to become a presence in all the major innovation spaces around the globe. So we started out with Israel. We went to the UK. We went to India. We went to all kinds of different places where they have technology centers and built banks and built portfolios of customers. The last and the most difficult for us was China. So we first started going to China in the year 2000. That's already 26 years ago. We spent our first, I would say, 7, 8 years in China, fundamentally trying to figure out what to do. China is very difficult for Westerners in general, and maybe for Americans in particular, because it is so different. I've been in a lot of different countries and worked in a lot of different countries. Not every country, obviously, but of all the places I've ever been, China is more different than any other. That is different from what I was used to here in the US. Its business culture, its legal system, its governance, everything was different. One of the big differences is you can't do much of anything in business without a license, and it's difficult to get a license to do whatever you want to do unless you have good government connections. So fundamentally, we spent like 7, 8 years wandering around China, always with people there. Now, in those 7 or 8 years, I only went over for a couple of weeks every year because I was, after all, running the bank. But we had people on the ground, teams on the ground every single day of every single year, starting in 2000 all the way up to when I moved there at the beginning of 2011. And what we were doing is what I call kissing frogs to find a prince. If you remember that from the fairy tales. Fundamentally, we were introducing ourselves to as many different government officials as we could until we found somebody that was interested in sponsoring us. And without a government sponsor, we couldn't get a license to do anything.
So, kind of, connecting on from that, could you say just a little bit more about what Silicon Valley Bank was actually hoping to get out of, a potential joint venture, or about your presence in China. And very important, now that you've mentioned that you actually did find a prince, what the prince, or by extension, China, was hoping to gain from that joint venture that you ultimately started.
Yeah, so the first question is really easy. We were trying to do in China what we do everywhere else, or I should say did do everywhere else. And that was serve technology companies by providing them with financial services that they need in order to grow and prosper. But because technology is global, every technology company practically reaches overseas for customers, for collaborators, for suppliers. It is a global industry. Almost all technology companies are global. And that's the other thing we wanted to do, is set up a global network to help technology companies. So pretty simple. It was serve technology companies and become profitable doing so.
So what about the prince who ultimately...
Yeah, well, so our first prince, it turned out we ended up with a bunch of princes, but it took literally 8 or 9 years to find the first prince. And here's how it happened. I was in Shanghai at the time. Somebody had invited me to a business gathering / party on one of the boats in the river that runs through Shanghai. So I gladly accepted. I got onto the boat, and within about a minute, there was this big burly man coming toward me. His name was Mr. Chun, and he was the party secretary of one of the 19 districts in Shanghai, the Yangpu district. And Mr. Chun had a mission. All of the party secretary, the head of every single geographic designation, the head of every single government body in China is a party secretary. And the party secretary is graded on a lot of different things, but one of the main ones is economic progress. And he was so interested in changing his district, the Yangpu district, from a rust belt to a knowledge-based industries economy. In other words, a technology-oriented economy. And he'd heard about me. Government officials in China do their homework. They know tons about people in other countries, a lot more than government officials in the US know about people in other countries. So he had my whole resume, he had me targeted, he knew I was coming, and he was going to make friends. He came right up to me, and first thing he did was something very unusual in China. I think if there's any Chinese here, you'll agree with me, he gave me a bear hug. And that doesn't happen that often. As a matter of fact, when I started taking Chinese lessons, one of the early readers that I used to learn Chinese had a chapter in it. And the title of the chapter, I'll say it in English, was Chinese Don't Hug Strangers. And this guy gave me a hug every single time he saw me from then on until ultimately when I left China in 2019. And his goal was to get us to set up a joint venture bank. I just should say a bank, joint venture comes later, in the Yangpu district, because he thought that was part and parcel of what he was going to do to turn his district into a mini Silicon Valley.
Wow. I know that, right? I mean, the joint venture then ultimately did get started, and you did a lot of work, and you described that in your beautiful book that we're going to raffle out. in a minute. And there is a line from the book that really, I mean, there's a lot in the book that caught my attention, but one that I thought was really intriguing. On page 39, you mentioned that one of the most valuable pieces of advice you received was 先斩后奏, to execute first and then report to the emperor. And I wanted to ask you, by the way, who gave you that piece of advice? And could you share some examples when that approach worked well for you and when it got you into trouble, and why it was so different in a way from what you were used to in the United States?
Yeah, that is really a key point that you bring up. So first of all, in the first couple of years in China, I went out of my way to meet people. Chinese government officials, members of the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese business people, expats who were experts at living in China, anybody where I thought I could get help. And it's to learn the terrain. And one of the first people I met a couple of months into it was a guy who, I'm not even sure I can remember his exact name now, but he was on the board of another bank. And somehow, I'm not sure if he targeted me. When you're moving to China to build a business, and you meet people, you never are quite sure if they've targeted you or if you've just been fortunate enough to accidentally meet them. So I'm not sure, but this guy made friends with me at some event. And of course, I immediately took the bait and I said, you know what, I could really use your advice. I'm starting this bank and I don't know what I'm doing, and maybe you could be helpful to me. So he spent about 8 sessions without pay, consulting with me for a couple of hours. And then mysteriously, after 8 sessions, he said, I don't think that I should be doing this. And he disappeared and I never saw him again. But in any case, one of the things he told me was what phrase that you just mentioned, and that is execute first and tell the emperor later. And I think what that meant was in ancient times, if the emperor had an enemy, you might take it upon yourself to kill that enemy, and then you'd tell the emperor later. Because if you told him before you actually stuck the knife in, it would be his decision, and he'd be responsible. But if you did it first and then told him afterward, he had plausible deniability, I think. I think that's the essence. But in any case, here's the main point. If you ran a bank in the US, let me tell you right now, just in case you decide to, when the Federal Reserve, which is our primary regulator, tells you to do something, you better do it. And if you want to do something that you haven't done before, you better ask permission first, because the Federal Reserve is always right. Whether they're right or not, they're always right. And there is no defense against them. You can't defend yourself against the Federal Reserve. So whenever I wanted to do something new at Silicon Valley Bank, of course I went to the Federal Reserve and asked permission. And if they came to our bank and they found errors, the first thing I had to do was literally bow, not quite literally, but it felt that way, and say, I'm so sorry, it's my fault, I'm the CEO, if something goes wrong, I'm responsible, I deeply apologize, I will fix it. That's the proper way to deal with a regulator. In China, the idea is more, don't get caught. If you want to do something that's different, go ahead and try it. And if you do get caught, depending on what your relationship is like with the government, you'll either get in trouble or you'll just get a small slap on the hand. And the regulator will tell you, better change it, we don't like it. So in China, you're really encouraged by the system to experiment. And you're taking a chance when you experiment. Because, as I said, if you don't have a good relationship with the regulator and the regulator catches you doing something that you're not supposed to do, you'll either get a mild slap, no problem, or you'll get in real trouble. And real trouble could mean prison. So how do you prevent going to prison? You make sure you have good relationships with the government officials. You take them to dinner. You visit with them regularly. You praise them at every opportunity. You tell them how smart they are and what a good job they're doing and how much you like working in their jurisdiction. And then if you do something that you're not supposed to do and you get caught, you're probably likely okay, unless it's really egregious, in which case you could be in real trouble. So an example of where that came up. Their interest rates in China in that era, and to a certain extent today too, were all controlled. In other words, the government told you how much to charge your customers for loans, and the government told you how much to pay your customers for deposits. But you never seemed to get enough deposits. And you thought to yourself, if I can get more deposits, I'd be better off. So there are different things you could do. Many, many bankers, honestly, this is true, give kickbacks to CFOs of client companies. It's kind of like, if you put all your company's deposits with my bank, I'll slip you a red envelope periodically. And that's very, very common. And the other thing you could do is figure out if you could pay higher interest rates. Well, that's illegal unless you can qualify for a license to pay higher interest rates. Every single discrete activity in banking in China requires a separate license. In the US and in most other countries I'm familiar with, if you get a banking license, you can do anything other banks would do. One license covers everything. In China, you need a license to open up a checking account. You need a license to open up a savings account. You need a license if you want to pay a higher interest rate to depositors. Actually, a bank like ours requires 25, 30 different licenses in China. And the government doesn't dole them out all at once. They do it slowly, over time. And you've got to suck up in order to qualify to get the license. So in any case, where it came into play was, there was one point where we desperately needed that license to allow us to pay a higher interest rate on deposits. And they wouldn't give it to us. We went to them over and over again. They wouldn't give it to us. And then some guy from another bank dropped by and said, we've heard you really need that license and you can't get one. I'll tell you what, you can rent our license. Now, I was expecting more laughs because that, from an American point of view, is bizarre. If I told the Federal Reserve I was renting a license from somebody else to do business, that would be curtains for me. But yeah, he was serious. And so we talked to our joint venture partners, because we were in a joint venture, and they said, of course you could do it. I said, in the US, you'll get into real trouble. No. Just go ahead and do it. Rent their license. You can offer the product you want. And if the regulators don't like it, eventually they'll tell you. But you have a nice relationship with them. You are constantly buddying up to them. So if they one day decide they don't want you doing that, they'll just give you a little slap. And we did that, and it worked beautifully. But I'll tell you, our board of directors here in the U.S. was furious. They just thought that was the most insane, irresponsible behavior. And they really wanted to stop me.
Wow.
But we did it.
You mentioned now already multiple times how important going to dinner with people seems to be. Before I knew that we weren't going to have a projector here, I had asked Ken to send me some photos. I wanted, we were going to share with you. We can't do that, but there was one photo that was really wonderful. It was of you with very red cheeks in front of a dinner table holding your belly. And I wanted you to talk about that photo. So please picture Ken holding his belly and his cheeks very, very red that seemed to...
Well, it just so happened that a couple of days before, some of my colleagues, and all of my colleagues were Chinese. We had like 300 people, and there were only, I think, 2 of us that were from the U.S. Everybody else was Chinese. Some of my colleagues took us to this Buddha park, which is, it's a little hard to describe, but it's like a huge park in, it's in Zhejiang province, you may remember it, and there are tons of Buddhas, giant Buddhas there, giant Buddhas. And there's one in particular that made me laugh. He was huge, and he was sitting there like this, and rubbing his belly, I guess. And so I was, in that picture you're talking about, pretending to be that guy. Because believe it or not, I had an even larger belly in that era.
You told me that, right, and you've already mentioned it, that so much of the business dealings that you had to do actually happened around big dinner tables, and there was a lot of drinking involved.
Huge.
Yeah.
Huge. Now, there's an alcohol in China that we don't seem to have here. I think you can get it in some specialty liquor store, but it's called baijiu, and it comes in a can, and it's the favorite alcohol of government officials and of businessmen, not so much women, in China. It's extremely potent. And it's one of those things that goes down very quietly and smoothly, and then 5 or 10 minutes later, you feel like you've been hit in the head because it's so impactful. And I have to say that was an aspect of doing business in China that I didn't like, but Chinese business dinners are important because it's all about relationships. And many, many Chinese business people and government officials have this belief that you can't really trust somebody until they've gotten stink drunk with you. And so you get invited to these parties or dinners, and the dinner would focus on 2 things. One was drinking as much baijiu as they could get down you, and the other one was sucking up to higher ups. So people would have a little baijiu, and then they would take the stand and say, I just want to recognize Frederick Green here. He's the most amazing professor at the entire university. I just love working with him. And that's very common practice, sucking up and getting drunk.
Wow.
There's more to China than that, but those are key features.
So, we haven't talked all that much about the actual joint venture, and of course you talk a lot about that in the book, and I don't want to, spoiler alert, but of course the joint venture ultimately did not work out the way that you had hoped it would. I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about, what are the 1 or 2 things you wish you had known going into this? You could have done differently.
Yes. I would like to talk about 2 different things. Let's start with that one. What I wished I'd known before. And the other one would be what actually goes wrong. But let me start with what I wished I'd known before. And that is, if you are going to do business in China, you might take the approach that we took, which is I would go for a couple of weeks every year, and then I'd have people on the ground day in, day out, all year long for several years, trying to build relationships or find people that I could meet in those 2 weeks a year when I came over. But here's the most important thing to realize. China is really different. It takes a long time to figure it out. People that aren't culturally sensitive may take even longer, meaning years and years and years to figure it out. So don't believe that going over for 2 weeks a year, no matter how many years running you do that, teaches you enough to do business in China. You've got to live there. So when people say, what would you have done different? Well, I mean this a little facetiously, but I would have left my wife, moved to China, married a Chinese person, and spent about 10 years trying to understand China through her eyes and those of all of her relatives and friends. Now, obviously, I don't mean that seriously, but until you become part of the fabric, which will never really happen, no matter how hard you try, but until you at least make an honest attempt to become part of the fabric, it's impossible to understand China. And why is that? Because people go to China and spend years, and either they never really understand it, or on the outside chance that they do, they don't tell you about it when they come back. So I have read at least 150 books about China, many of them written by people who spent time there trying to build a business. But do they ever admit that they failed? No, they don't. They don't admit that they failed for two different reasons. One is it's embarrassing, and they don't want all their shareholders to realize what a mess they made of things. And the other one is usually they failed because working with the Chinese Communist Party is difficult, and people are afraid when they come back that they'll get their company into trouble if they write a book about how difficult it was to work with the Chinese Communist Party. So they avoid that. So reading books won't get you there. Talking to people might get you somewhere, but not that far. That is, people who have come and come back, gone and come back. The ideal, as I say, would be to go live in China for a few years and try to get to know it from the inside out. And I would like to mention just two anecdotes that I think help to explain what I'm talking about. I had one of the best assistants I possibly could have had when I was in China. She was terrific. And she really was trying to help me. About 6 or 8 months after I got there, one day she looked at me and you could tell she was annoyed, almost disgusted. And she says, "Ken, you are never going to succeed here in China." And it kind of hurt my feelings. I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, "You have a very bad habit. You are the kind of person who always says what you mean and mean what you say. We don't do that here in China. And unless you change, you're not going to be successful." And the other thing that she told me was, you sit through these meetings with government officials, I translate everything for you, and you think you've understood the meeting, but you haven't. And it was that inspired me to hire my second assistant. And these two assistants then, I'm leaving their names out on purpose, they went with me on every call. And they took turns translating and taking notes. One would translate while the other one took notes. And then afterwards, they would sit there with me for an hour and tell me what people really meant when they said whatever they said. And that was so helpful. I got so much further because it's true. The communication style in China is often more through innuendo than it is by being direct. And in being as direct as I was actually not communicating well. If anything, I was just annoying people or causing them to wonder if I had taken leave of my senses, because I would say things that nobody would actually say if they were really Chinese. The other thing that was a big lesson for me was, I don't know, a lot of you are in business courses, I think, and I don't know if you've ever been exposed to negotiation training, but almost everybody in my age bracket in the US who's in business was at some point earlier in their career forced to take negotiation classes. And the classes were often called Getting to Yes. And they were all based on a book that was published in 1982 or 3 by something called the Harvard Negotiation Project. And this book basically says, if you are negotiating an agreement with somebody else from a different entity, both of you have to try to find out what the other's needs are. You'll have a set of needs. The counterparty will have a set of needs. And it's incumbent on both of you working together to craft a deal that makes both parties happy. Well, I can tell you that the Chinese Communist Party has never read Getting to Yes. On the plane, one day, going to China, before we even moved there, I read a book that at the time became quite famous, but people have forgotten. It was written by Lucian Pai, who was a famous sinologist at the MIT in Massachusetts. And his book was entitled Chinese Commercial Negotiation Techniques. And I read that book. It's only 100 pages. And I thought to myself, this Lucian Pai guy, he must be the most jaded person I've ever encountered in my life, because he said, if you go to China, you'll be negotiating with higher level business people and members of the party, and they will be using these techniques in their negotiation. Misrepresentation, intimidation, shaming, and in general, they are anxious to win as much for their side as they can, and they have no interest in seeing you win anything if they can figure out how to make that happen. So I thought this guy was crazy, because I was brought up by parents who believed if you were nice to other people, they would be nice to you. Within a year, I experienced everything that Lucian Pai wrote about. Everything. And the negotiations with my joint venture partner took at least 1.5 years. And at the end of the 1.5 years, we had a great big agreement that was put together by the lawyers who were helping us negotiate with each other. I think that my counterparty, the joint venture partner, just put that agreement in the fireplace. And from then on, they would do whatever they could get away with. And they expected that I would do that too. They were shocked when I didn't take advantage when I had the opportunity to take advantage. So it is so different. That's my point. The basic way we communicate with each other, how we expect others to behave in a negotiation, it is so different that if you don't live there, it will come as a huge shock, and you may go a few years in a row totally misunderstanding what's happening around you.
Wow. We're almost at the end. I have one last question. You've kind of already answered it, but as the chair of the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures, I just have to ask you about your love for languages and culture. You taught yourself Chinese at age 60 and reached HSK 4. That deserves a round of applause, actually. But that's pretty amazing. And of course, earlier in your career, you were a professor of German. So my question, do you believe that studying foreign languages and spending time abroad made you a better banker? And would you recommend that path to our students?
Yeah, I'll answer that. But before I answer that, I do want to say one thing. I studied Chinese starting at age 62 for 8 consecutive years, 3 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. And one of those hours every single day was with my Chinese teacher, who was really very good. And yet, after all that study, I ended up testing out at something like roughly the level of a 10-year-old.
Yeah, don't tell that to our students. Guys, 1 year, Chinese 101, 102, you'll be fluent speakers, okay?
Because Chinese is just very difficult, and I also wouldn't recommend, if you're going to study Chinese, don't wait until you're 62, because you don't learn languages quite that fast at older ages. But the answer to your question is, if I would recommend to anybody, whether they're going into business or not, no matter what they're going to do with their lives, I would recommend to almost everybody that they go to another country for a few years and spend a couple of years in another place. Both my sons took gap years and went to other countries and just hung out and learned a language before they went to university, because I really believe that you don't understand the U.S. until you have seen it through the eyes of somebody in another country and through the eyes of the news media in another country. And it's hard to even understand yourself if you haven't had that experience, because people in other places live differently. Some of them live similarly, meaning the UK isn't that different from the US, but it's different. And Germany isn't extremely different from the US, but it's different. And some places like China are really different. And I think that our biggest problem and as Americans in dealing with people from other places is that we haven't had sufficient experience in other places. And so we do what I call, we superimpose our mental models on other people, and they don't fit. So what do I mean by that? It's very simple, really. It sounds probably complicated the way I'm wording it, but as you go through life, starting when you're just beginning to walk, you start building mental models. In other words, you look at the world around you and you don't think about it this way, it just happens. You develop a theory about what's happening. You understand how it works. But your understanding is totally based on your experience in your home, in your neighborhood, in your city, in your school, in our country. And then when we go to other places, we take all those mental models with us. And of course, we're subconsciously superimposing them on other people because we want to understand them quickly. And actually, I'll give you a kind of a silly example that tells exactly what I'm talking about. And that is that I remember the first year that I lived in Germany, I was in the dormitory, and every floor of the dormitory had its own little kitchen. And the students would get groceries, they'd bring them into the kitchen, and they'd make themselves something on the stoves there in the kitchen. And I was at a loss because I didn't even know, how to go grocery shopping. But I'd sit there and I'd watch people, and I'd try to figure it out. And then I saw these two guys that were building something that looked like an omelet. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I can do that. So I wrote down all their ingredients. And I went to the store and I got the ingredients. And the next day I started cooking this thing. And these two guys came up to me and says, "What is that you're doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing what you did yesterday." And they said, "Are you crazy? That was nothing that we were doing yesterday that makes any sense. We were just screwing around." And my point is, it's so hard to figure out what other people are doing until you live with them, talk with them, get to know them, and understand the way they think about things. So one big mistake that Americans make when they go to China is this. We American business people, like take me, in my mind, there is a party, there are two of them, Democrats and Republicans, and they're over here. Then there's also the government, which is over here. And then there are business people, which are over here. And they don't really have that much to do with each other. And in Silicon Valley, we always used to believe, don't ever go to Washington, D.C. It's a big mistake. You don't want to have anything to do with government. That was 30 years ago. Things are changing now. People realize they have to interface with government. But you go to China thinking parties over here, and there are two of them. Government is here, business is here. And the people go over there and they say to themselves, well, I avoid government in the US, so I'll just avoid government in China. And it'll work. And what they don't realize is you can't avoid government in China, because government in China runs anything it feels like running. And I suppose if you open up a flower shop, you can avoid government. You just have to get a flower selling license. And for the most part, government will leave you alone. But if you're doing something like opening up a bank, you first of all got to get 25 licenses, which will take you forever. And secondly, you have to know government, because they can decide on any given day that they don't like what you're doing and force you to do it differently, or maybe even arrest you. So that's a mental model. The mental model is parties over here, government's here, business is here. They don't have anything to do with each other. But in China, they're all the same thing. So when I would have conversations with the guy who was the CEO of the Shanghai Pudong Development Bank, he was my conversation partner, and that was our joint venture partner. I used to at first wonder, well, we're having a conversation. Is he wearing his banker hat? Or is he wearing his government hat, because he was technically a member of government? Or is he wearing his Chinese Communist Party hat? And I used to wonder about that. And then one day it occurred to me, they're all the same hat. And then it occurred to me that he doesn't even know he has three hats. He thinks he only has one hat. And they're all the same thing. And that's so hard. You can grasp it intellectually, but to live it every day is so confusing until you do it for a long time and get used to it.
Wow, fantastic. I think this is a really great place to stop. I know we could go on forever, but we do want to have some time for Q&As, and of course we have to do the raffle. But just on that last point, I think what Ken is really saying is you guys should all do study abroad through one of our fantastic CSU study abroad programs, whether it's China or Europe or somewhere else. And of course, by taking our wonderful certificates in multilingual and international business or international tourism competencies, where you're already one step there. So please join me in welcoming Ken. We'll give him a round of applause, and then we'll do some Q&A, right? So Tammy, I think there's a little bit of time, but first, Tammy. So we're going to do a raffle, right? We have, let's see, we have 18 books here, and okay, Ken, are you going to be the fairy to pull out? Let's see. Okay, you're going to pull out about, yeah, you're going to read out names. Okay, and if you hear your name, just come up.
Shinfang.
Let's see. Fang Xin, yeah? Fang Xin, wow. Okay, I'll read a couple too, and then you pull out some more.
Ooh, these are sticky.
These are sticky. Oh. Huang Jiayun.
Yeah.
Huang Jiayun. Okay. And this one.
Oscar George. Okay. How do you pronounce that name?
Oscar Jorge Ochoa.
Yeah, right. Ochoa. Yeah. Ochoa.
Okay. Fantastic. Yeah. Okay. Ooh. These are sticky. I'll keep pulling them out.
Lavender Maria Walsh.
Together. Okay.
A. Jackson.
Hey, Jackson. Yeah. Okay. Gotta keep track.
Denise Mabena.
Yeah. Okay, you guys. Okay, Tammy, you got to help. Tammy, can you give us a hand with the books? And you guys who recognize your names, come up here, and Tammy is gonna hand you a book.
Okay, Jonathan Sung.
Yeah. Actually, it's oh yeah, you'll do it. These are really sticky. Okay. Josie Zuidema from IBIS. And then
Lehman Tran.
Lehman Tran. Okay.
Shreyan Tai.
Xueyuan Cai Xueyuan. Also, okay. And this one.
Oh, this is easier. Alice Wu.
Alice Wu.
Julia Zanona. Business strategy.
Ooh, okay.
Kevin Sologista.
Yeah. Okay.
Larry Ma.
Larry Ma. Okay.
You sure we have that many books?
Yeah, we gotta keep track. How many devices now? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So 4 more.
Camille Brown.
Camille Brown.
Liao Ufei. Ufei.
Liao Ufei, yeah. Did you keep track? I think we have 2 more. I think. Oh, okay.
Jesse Eshazaretta.
And one last one.
Anna.
Yeah, that's just Anna. Anna? Here? Okay. And tell me, is that the last book? That's the last book? Okay, good. Wow. Okay, we managed to keep track. Well, well done. Well done. Okay. I know that some of you might have to leave. If you have to leave to another class, just take off. But so Kenneth agreed to stick around a little bit for questions. So we have, let's see, you're gonna use your mic, and we're gonna have this mic. Oh, everybody some folks got to stick around for questions. Okay. And I'm gonna find the questioners, and we're gonna use that mic for the question. Yeah? And maybe you can just say your name and your program, and then the question.
Absolutely. My name is Jacques Vigneault. I am in the apparel design program, also the business program. From what I understand from this interview, it is very important to be immersed in the culture and understand how business operates in China. If you don't have multiple years to spend to live in China and become immersed in the culture, what would you recommend to briefly get accustomed to doing business in China? Just like very quick guide. Sorry, is that too general?
No, great question.
Well, I could recommend a handful of books. That would be one thing. And
Start with Ken's. Start with Ken's book.
Yeah, start with my book. Yeah, and but there are so many books on China out there, and really a couple of hundred anyway, and many of them are good in a way, but they won't really prepare you to do business. So it's important to be selective. I think I've read 170 books on China in the last 15 years, and I believe that only 5 or 6 of them would have helped me in terms of doing business in China. Secondly, I think that it's really important to spend time searching for a good assistant, because my 2 assistants that I mentioned before were just immeasurably helpful to me in terms of understanding things. And I also think it's important to go to China with what I call an open heart and an open mind, and leave your mental models behind, because all they can do is get in the way. You almost have to become a blank slate and just soak up as much as you can, and then talk to your assistants about what does it mean. This is what I experienced. This is what this meeting went like. This is what this person said. What did they mean? How do I interpret that? And I would not be in a rush. I think the interesting thing is that the Americans, including myself, when we go to China, we're in a rush. We want to get stuff done. And so we try to move as quickly as we can. And honestly, I began to think that the Chinese Communist Party, which fundamentally runs everything, was kind of like our sons when they were wee lads. You couldn't negotiate with them because they had all day to negotiate. I had to go to work. They didn't. And so they were headstrong, and they had goals of their own, and rushing things never got me anywhere. So I think you have to be patient and just learn. That's my best advice to anybody. And it would have been my best advice to myself if I had understood then what I understand now. By the way, nobody asked this yet, but I want to anticipate a question and answer it. And that is, people often say, how do you feel about China? And Notwithstanding everything I've said in the last hour, because a lot of it is somewhat negative, my wife and I both feel that the years we lived in China were the most interesting years of our lives. They were beyond a shadow of a doubt fascinating. And if I'm talking about the 1.3 billion people who are not in the party, I would say they're just like people everywhere, great people, interesting people. People were nice to us all the time, and we made a lot of interesting friends. So that's all the good news. China's a great place. The less good news is that if you're going to do business in China, you're going to be doing it with the Chinese Communist Party. And I would not deliberately subject myself to that again, because it was just so frustrating. So terribly frustrating. Or here's a good story. A few years ago, I met some guy who was about in his 40s, and he was saying, he's lived in China since he was 22, and he says, I just love it here. It's so amazing. Everything is great. And I said, well, what's your story? He said, well, I went to a university in the US. I majored in Chinese. I got to know enough Chinese. It was a good start anyway. And then I moved to Shanghai. I got a couple of different jobs. I learned Chinese in daily life. I met a lot of people. I met a Chinese woman. We're married. We have kids. And a few years ago, I decided to start a business. And I've got about 40 employees. Our business does great. And the government isn't interfering with me in the least. He says, it works perfectly. What's there to complain about? I said, well, what is your business? And he said that he makes spatulas for barbecuing. So, your backyard barbecue, the flipper and the fork and he makes those things. Well, I can tell you that those are not what the Chinese government would consider strategically important. If they were, they would be involved. You would have a partner. Because every Western company in China has two things these days. One is a joint venture partner. It's like living with a big brother whom you consider annoying. And the other thing they have is what's called a party committee. And the party committee is the secret committee behind the board. And they can make any decision for you that they feel like making. So you'll find it frustrating if you're not prepared to deal with it.
All right, any other questions? Oh.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm an accounting major. I was wondering, in your time doing business in China, did you ever find yourself intentionally or unintentionally burning a bridge with a connection you had built, and how did you navigate that situation?
Yes, I did. Once, I remember, I didn't actually burn the bridge to the ground, but I set it on fire. And then I had to put it out and repair it. I got really angry in a meeting once because I felt that we were being browbeaten by our joint venture partner and forced to do things which were unreasonable. And I lost my temper briefly. And the one thing I can tell you is it's never a good idea to lose your temper in China. So here's a good example for you. Have you noticed that our president seems to get angry periodically? And he says a lot of things that some other people find insulting. Now watch Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping if he has any emotions in him anywhere, you'll never see them. He always looks stone-faced. He never loses his temper, at least not in public. And that's what's considered proper behavior. You don't lose your temper. You don't show emotion. And so it was a huge mistake on my part. And then I had to go grovel and apologize and apologize and apologize. And eventually I won the guy back over. And we got along very well after a couple of months of my groveling. But it was a mistake. Because in China, you don't win by yelling at people. You win by having leverage. And if you're in an altercation or having a difference of views, you have to identify your own leverage. What's my leverage? And identify the other person's leverage. What's their leverage? And if you don't have any leverage, give up. If you do have leverage, apply it. But don't get angry. And don't yell at people and that kind of thing. It's just not a good idea.
I think that's good. Life advice in general. Just don't get angry. Don't yell at people. Do we have any other questions? Oh.
Thank you for the very inspiring talk, Dr. Wilcox. I was a little curious about the second half of your title, Building and Losing a Bank in China. Can you talk a little bit about how the bank was lost? Thank you.
Sure. If you don't mind, I'm going to put my hat on so that light doesn't bother my eyes quite so much. Because, here. There. Now I can see you. So, our goal in building a bank in China, I've already described. The goal of the Chinese Communist Party in inviting me to come over and build the bank in China was so they had heard that Silicon Valley Bank was the #1 bank in the United States in terms of dealing with technology companies. And they wanted to learn how to do that. So their goal was learning. And fundamentally, there was a 3-step process. The first step was to encourage us to come. And they did that by having a gentleman who was really high in the Chinese Communist Party get together with me for several meetings in 2009 and 10. His name was Yu Zhengsheng, and he eventually, when Xi Jinping came to power, he ended up going onto the standing committee, so he was one of the 7 most powerful people in China. And Yu Zhengsheng just lavished flattery or praise on me in these meetings. He kept telling me I was the smartest American he'd ever met, and that our bank was more important than any bank he'd ever seen in his life, and it was far better than even Goldman Sachs. And he went on and on like this. So the first step is lavish praise, promise you all kinds of assistance, and lure you over. The second phase was a year after my wife and I moved to China, we finally got the license, one October day. But at the same time that we got the license, we learned 2 other things. One was that we needed 25 licenses, not 1, and that the 1 license basically didn't enable us to do anything other than call ourselves a bank, and that it might take decades to get the other 24. That's the first thing they told us. It was like, big smile, here's your license, we're so happy. You realize, of course, you'll need 24 more, And the other thing is they told us on the day they gave us the license that we would not be allowed to use Chinese currency for 3 years, which is like saying to some Chinese person, I'm giving you a license to open up a Chinese restaurant in San Francisco, but you can't use Chinese food for the first 3 years. It's useless. So we couldn't do anything anyway. We were sort of tied up. And that was on purpose so that our joint venture partner could learn everything possible from us. And then the third step was after 3 years, they came back and said, we're so happy. This is the day that we liberate you. From now on, you can use Chinese currency. And by the way, we have so admired your business model that we've decided to build a bank of our own right here in Shanghai using your business model. And we would love you to spend a few months with them, teaching them things that they didn't quite understand during 3 years of hanging out with you. So would you mind doing that? And when I said, why do you need one of your own? You own 50% of this one. They just laughed and said, we know, but we really want one of our own. So that's how we didn't lose the bank exactly. It just never flourished.
Any other questions?
My name is Miguel. I'm a business major student, and my question is, I guess, not perhaps just in China, but in business in general and those relationships. Would you ever say that, obviously there's like a lot of just negotiations and all that going on behind the scenes, but would you ever say that any of those relationships ever turn out to be like a true friendship that you still have today and someone you could like really rely on?
Are you talking about in other countries or in China?
Just business relationships.
Business relationships, sometimes there are degrees of being a true relationship. And I would say many business relations, I have a lot of friends today that I did business with for the past 40 years. And some of them are, I would say, pretty much true friends. The issue in China is not that Chinese people are incapable of friendship. Of course, there's at least 1.3 billion of them that aren't in the party. But party members actually sign or swear an oath that the goals of the party have to supersede my own. And so that there's limits on that. They can still be nice to you though, in terms of everyday, polite, friendly.
My name's Jessica. I'm a Chinese major, and I was wondering, so your bank failed in China. It didn't open up, and you had to run on the bank in America. So why should we be listening to your business advice?
Why should we be doing what?
Listening to your business advice if you've had 2 failed banks?
Well, that's kind of confrontational. I guess that you, well, first of all, during the years that I ran the bank, it was one of the most profitable and fastest growing banks in the country. And so to the issue of our bank in an overall sense, when it disappeared in 2023, it was because the management team, long after I was gone, made a very serious error. And it was an error that could not be fixed, which I can describe to you, but that's kind of an anomaly, actually. And I don't think it has anything to do with me. And the bank in China didn't fail. It just was never given enough licenses that it could succeed. And if it had had enough licenses, I think there's a good chance that we could have succeeded. But we weren't given enough licenses. And without licenses, you can't do business.
All right, I think we have time for one last short question. Okay.
Hi, I'm John. Thank you for the talk. So my question is basically, we've seen over the decades lots of joint ventures, not just in banking, but like in other sectors with China, like automotive, tech. And then we see the companies that don't enter these joint ventures, but eventually get bought out by Chinese companies. Like I think TCL recently bought Bravia from Sony. I was wondering, is the risk of entering these joint ventures worth it, or eventually will these big Chinese companies eventually just buy them out anyway?
Well, my answer to that would be, I've studied many, many Western companies that have gone to China, and fundamentally, they all experienced the same thing that we did. They were encouraged with praise and promises to come. They were then tied up with a joint venture. And their secret sauce, their IP, whatever it was transferred from them to their Chinese joint venture partner. Eventually, the Chinese government built competitors in China using their IP and improvements that they made on it. So it's not just as simple as taking their IP, they did improve it. And then eventually those companies ended up leaving China. So here's a good one for you if you want to study somebody at the other end of the spectrum. Our arc, as I describe it, was short. It was only about 10 years. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, but we'll focus on General Motors because I know it best. Their arc was 35 years. They came to China, forced into a joint venture. Then there were certain restrictions placed on them. For example, sourcing. They had to source in China, which meant they had to teach manufacturing companies in China how to build their parts. And then there was forced technology transfer that was required of them that they share their IP with their Chinese joint venture partner. And then there was an era when they were at the top of their arc, and they earned a very high percentage of their revenues in China. In the last 3 years, they've plummeted. They're now exiting China, more or less with their tail between their legs. And now China is competing with them globally. And I believe General Motors might not exist in another 5 to 10 years. So the arc is the same for most companies, but the length of the arc is different.
Wow. Sell your General Motors stocks now.
There's another great book. I say another great book, like I think mine's great. But there's a book coming out toward the end of this year by a guy named Michael Dunn called Car Wars. And that's actually a study of the American auto industry in its entire experience in China, entering in the 80s and now leaving.
All right, I think we are at the hour. Thank you again to coming, sharing all your experiences. And I've said this to Kenneth before. You know, one of the things that I really, really liked about the book, and I've read I haven't read 170, but I've read a bunch of books about China and doing business in China, even though I'm not a business person. And what I really like about this one is that you are so frank in admitting what went wrong. And that really makes for a very, very, very intriguing read. So thank you again, and thank you all for sticking it out, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.